Ghana, to Accra, for almost 40 years. Came here as a young teenager towards the end of my teenage years, and I was on the way to the belly of the beast, as we radicals describe the United States. And after that, I came back. It is the country of Kwame Nkrumah, of all the amazing Ghanaians who supported us in Southern Africa when we were struggling against apartheid, and everybody told us we couldn't beat the apartheid system. You know, they were armed by the big boys of the world. They had the biggest guns. How could we? And yet we did. And I think that the lessons, yes, we did. Well, I mean, we still got a lot of work to do in our region and, of course, on our continent. But I think for those of us who were actively engaged within Southern Africa and wherever we were in this love for freedom, this desire, to reclaim our dignities as African people, we bring that to the analyses that we make, the critical, radical analyses that we continue to make in transforming our continent and our countries. And so I thank you very much for allowing me to share some ideas with you this afternoon. As I said in my abstract, I really would like to trouble in old ways. I don't want to take it for granted that we're all on the same page. And in fact, having worked with issues of gender conceptually as well as in terms of activism for so many years, I still find that it's like we are continuously reinventing the wheel. This issue is so deeply embedded and so intractable that we have to go over the ground over and over and over and over. It's really like, raising children in the lifetime of a woman and in all the millions of years that women have socialized human beings. I'm not drawing parallels, I'm just using the metaphor. So in my abstract, I tried to set the tone, the context for some of the issues that I would like to raise this afternoon. I usually speak about feminism. And to talk about gender was really quite a challenge for me because gender has shifted internationally and also on the continent. It has become so re-embedded in more conservative discourses, and it's almost unrecognizable to those of us who picked up the torch when the construct first entered our spheres of thinking, and we ran with it. And often we didn't really know which direction we were going, but we knew that in our lives, in our thinking lives, and in our lived reality, had arrived a notion, a tool that was really going to change us, and it did. And what I want to do today is to try and revisit the dynamism of this notion and resituate it in ideas and possibilities of transformation on our continent. So I really begin by, arguing that African societies have undergone tremendous changes at all the different levels of our existence, and particularly since the moment of independence. The moment of independence ushers in a new time for us. Of course, all the centuries of African history were moments of new time also, and they are marked. Even though they have been systematically erased, those attempts have not really succeeded. And many of us who are historians and who are historians, retrieving the narratives and the contributions and the struggles of our foremothers, we are returning to those sites of erasure and reclaiming, finding our foremothers and repositioning them in a collective history about who we are as Africans in all the amazing ways that we have existed and continue to be. So for most Africans, becoming citizens through independence at the moment of independence had assumed a normality and inevitability that is seldom connected to our recent past. Most young Africans assume that life has sort of been like this always. There's a taking for granted of the opportunities that independence presents for us. It's a casualness, I think, which bespeaks a sense of entitlement that is both earned as well as taken for granted. And I'm going to use the notion of entitlement in my paper as a bridge between the activism and the advocacy and lobbying and the tremendous work that different groups of Africans in aspiring to become citizens have engaged in. But I also want to make a distinction between entitlement and rights, because often what we've done is we really haven't looked carefully enough at the notion of entitlement and the exercise of entitlement as a consciousness. Okay, a consciousness that emerges from this desire to be free, to live lives of dignity. And what entitlement does for us is that it projects us forward into the public. We often use the vehicles that we construct either as members of women's organizations or as members of various civil society organizations. But it is entitlement that drives the demands that we make on the state. And it is when that entitlement is recognized through an engagement with those who occupy the state that we can begin to formulate rights as social outcomes of struggle. So I think it's really important for us to think about the journey that we take at the moment of independence towards a status of citizenship that is substantive, that is active and engaging, and that is continuously reformulated and improved, expanded, deepened, and protected. Okay, because often if we don't do that, what we think are rights, which are really reflections of our own sense of entitlement, disappear overnight. There's a shift at the level of politics, and we lose what we think were rights, when actually these were merely articulations of entitlement. So in my more recent work, I've been doing this, and I'm not going to speak about this very much today because it's really more about how to resituate and reconceptualize citizenship. But during the discussion period, please feel free to speak with me about that, and I'll be most glad to do so. So this sense of entitlement that characterizes the generations, the current generations, 40 years after independence, 50 years after independence, tends to paper over many of the unfinished tasks that face us as we build our societies. For the majority of Africans who live in female bodies and are confronted with the realities of being women in the private and public institutions and spaces of all African societies, the assumptions that define Africa's progress and everyday realities are not as untroubled as they might seem to the unattentive observer. The persistent lag in institutional transformation in terms of gender equity, and I'm using the notion of equity here as a much more substantive notion that conceptually carries more than being equal to, the persistent lag in institutional transformation in terms of gender equity, which is often reflected in gaps in language expression, overt expressions of otherness in music and culture as performance and as conventions, and the persistence of exclusionary practices and policies within key social, political, and economic institutions remains a major challenge for all who are concerned with comprehensive progress on the continent. These challenges range across a spectrum of issues, from primary and tertiary educational institutions to national, regional, and continental structures that aspire to reform laws, political systems and practices, economic institutions, and to determine access to financial resources, to the very definition of who knows what and receives which rewards for their participation in national and continental development. So this afternoon, I want to attempt a very brief analysis of some of the key challenges facing intellectuals who are positioned within higher education institutions. And I've chosen this because, we could be here for years and years talking about all the different issues in depth that face us as challenges and as possibilities on our continent. But I want to focus on intellectuals who have either resisted attempts at gendering the mainstream within the academy, or who are making some attempts to restructure relations of power within such institutions. How this impacts upon the larger notions of African development, particularly in relation to the ideas of national progress and continental cooperation, will be scrutinized in order to make some suggestions about how we can begin to think of ourselves, imagine ourselves living in more inclusive ways. And so my main contention is that gendering human relationships around power, as it defines and contributes critical resources and distributes critical resources between women and men in any African society, is a critical and necessary stepping stone towards more sustainable and equitable human progress in the immediate and long-term future. What I'm saying is that we're not going to move ahead. We cannot, without bringing equity to relationships between us first, as women and men, as Africans, wherever we are located in terms of class, and all the other signifiers, as they are called in the new academy. And I want to start with looking at some of the patriarchal exclusions and struggles that women engage in for entitlement. Regardless of the many criticisms which accompany the introduction and application of gender as a conceptual, activist, and policy tool, the fact remains that its application across the ideological spectrum has changed African perspectives and discourses on power and identity forever. The flattened and presumably unproblematical political, cultural, and social landscapes occupied by Africans who were united by an intense desire for freedom from foreign domination over the past half-century are quietly slipping into the past, becoming part of our history. The temporal discourses of social and cultural consensus, most of which were necessitated by the imperative of presenting a united front in the face of external hegemony, have been eclipsed by the newness of the contemporary moment. Life has changed in class, race, and gendered ways, often beyond recognition for most people. And as the tide of sexual and ability movements gain further ground, these too will become the new indicators of life on the continent in undeniable ways. Africa is in a new century, and the debates and contestations of the new millennium present themselves most dramatically in the changing personal, community, national, and international relationships and systems of power. Gender is one of the notions and political policy issues that has taken center stage in the numerous contested sites of our societies, eliciting reactions that range from outright hostility and rejection to more considered attempts at understanding and using the notion for purposes of redistribution and renegotiated intimacies. We all engage in this. In our private lives, we are renegotiating intimacy seriously. And when necessary, we bring the state in through laws against marital rape, for example. One of the most difficult issues in terms of gendering, our lives and positioning equality and equity at the center of our relationships as women and men, largely. In the public, we are also seriously engaged in redistribution, discourses, debates, arguments, struggles, as women and men, and also in terms of class. In Ghana, it's not so much about race, although race hovers on the edges and sometimes in the center of the economy and the infrastructure of wealth generation, the mines, the fisheries, the hotels. Ghana is becoming more and more raced in very contemporary ways, and it's going to become an issue that Ghanaians will have to face, as those disparities deepen. The contemporary moment holds many features from the past, from the familiar. We know a lot of the issues. We know many of the things that remain unresolved. But we do also see the emergence of new sets of relationships of power that are linked with what is described as globalization, and I call it neo-imperialism. Same thing, different day. Same story, in many ways. So therefore, however, as with all new ideas and the shifts that they cause, particularly in terms of economic and political systems of power, gender has generated a wide range of debates that center on claims of authenticity or otherness as foreignness, anxieties associated with threats to notions and practices of culture, which are really about the preservation of systems of patriarchal privilege and exclusion for men and boys, most of which impinge on the bodily and sexual integrity of women and girls in personally and socially devastating ways. And I think Patricia touched on that as well. Studies conducted in numerous countries, for example, in South Africa, Ghana, Uganda, Zambia, Senegal, and Zimbabwe, reflect this contradictory path that gender has traversed over the past 3 to 4 decades. In both urban and rural communities, underlying tensions around identity and the long-standing relationships of power embedded in ancient notions of maleness and femaleness have been rattled by the possibility of change. Women glimpse the possibilities of experiencing life differently, beyond the vistas that education promised, and to which most did not accede. And men are fearful and resentful that what they had assumed would always be the case, i.e. their privilege and the meanings of maleness and masculinity, which they had become accustomed to, regardless of what else changed, because policy it has to be situated at the interface between transformational discourses and the ways in which we make change. That's what policy should be about, the ways in which we make change. And we cannot make that change if we don't imagine it. And as long as the majority of Africans are unable to participate in that imaginary process, we will have, little partial expressions of a future that we dream of, which we hope will be better for everybody. That's not good enough. I really don't like it. I'm almost 60 years old. In 2 years' time, I'm going to be 60. And I've worked for, since I was maybe 15, 16 years old. So, it's like 40 years of really hard work. And still, I'm listening to rhetoric. I know you cannot measure a society or a continent's progress on the basis of one human being. That would be the ultimate sort of, what is it called? Who is that Greek god Nemesis, who went into the water? Who is it? It's Nemesis. Narcissist, yes, absolutely, thank you. I mean, that would be the ultimate narcissism. But a little bit of narcissism is okay too, you know, in terms of us imagining that we might see something a little more substantive in terms of changes, especially when we dedicate ourselves to, you know, crafting the future in different ways. So I begin by arguing that gender analysis really needs to be positioned in relation to the moment of independence. And we need to ask a critical question. How does gender analysis enter into the debates and discourses, the thinking processes of Africans about ourselves? How is it situated in the moment of independence? And I realized that it enters via the developmental discourse, because first it enters as women and development, and then it very quietly morphs into gender and development, and then stays there and becomes mainstreamed. And so it's a discourse that was premised on a liberal notion of social progress that is tied to the maintenance of an unequal relationship with the West, technologically, politically, and structurally. So the way in which it enters into our public domains, into our debates about policy, is in this really facile, weak, and ineffective way, as an add-on, as an attachment, you know, a superfluous appendage that can be gotten rid of when it's not convenient, okay? And we also know that liberalism is very shallow. It's the sweetening around the pill of capitalism. That's what it is. It's about declarations of inclusion without substantive, transformative inclusion of everybody. And so, for the past 40 years or so, we have struggled with a concept that was really very empty in terms of the ways in which we encountered it. Some of us quickly became disenchanted, and we decided, no, we want to find out where did it come from. And it must have come from somewhere, you know? Oh, and then we heard the European feminists saying, you know, I mean, it's about us, you know, we're the thinkers. We're the ones who crafted it and expressed it, and we're going to tell you about yourselves. And we're like, no. We are situated within history in very deep and old ways prior to the emergence of Europe or European societies. But we also know that we've engaged in struggles against inequality of various kinds, and that must be the source of this idea, of this tool. And so, as it enters into the African debates, it touches a deep vein within African societies in relation to issues of property and identity. And it goes beyond the public contestations over material and social wealth and power. And that's where the rub is. That when we relocate, we resituate gender as this amazing explanatory tool that comes out of women's and people's struggles for justice, for inclusion, and we realize that that's why it causes such discomfort and dis-ease. Even in its very light and liberal version, people were knee-jerking and backlashing, you know? And well, I mean, when you bring it as a feminist tool, now, I mean, you see people turn tail and run, okay? Women and men are frightened by the possibility, often, that they now have to encounter the really difficult tasks of social transformation. But that's the most beautiful thing that you can do with your life. You know? I mean, to engage with the taboos, with the exclusions, with the misogyny, with the hatred and the dis-ease. That's the most beautiful thing any human being can do. So, for example, women who are educated acquire a sense and a material reality which is reflective of what we call autonomy, a characteristic that is deeply feared and resisted in women everywhere. Over the past 4 decades, as women have become more visible and more public, crafting institutional and ideological vehicles through which to carry their individual and collective agendas into the center of African public spaces, insisting upon positioning their entitlements as rights within the state, the law, the judicial systems, the financial and commercial sectors, and within the academy. Their claims have not only highlighted the inadequacies of notions of culture and tradition that are embedded in the past, but these claims have also exposed the deep-seated contradictions and limitations of development as a discourse and as a practice. Often this demystification of development has been accompanied by new exclusions that are related to larger structural crises within our societies. This is where I think the newer challenges around the understanding and use of gender lie. Therefore, while I recognize that the notion has become largely commonsensical in ways that often lend themselves to contradictory explanations and interpretations, I would like to situate the notion within a scholar-activist intersectional framework and focus on an arena within which gender is defined ideologically as a thinking tool and as an activist tool. I want to look briefly at education as both an ideological and policy issue wherein gender contestations about knowledge and progress play out. While all social reality is invariably gendered, not simply as a consequence of gendered analysis as a contemporary analytical perspective, education and the production of knowledge in particular reflect both the tensions and the achievements that have been generated in African societies and elsewhere by the shifts in women's identities. As a consequence of access to education and the acquisition of a consciousness of entitlement, largely through activism and lobbying, which translate women have systematically gendered African politics at all levels of social engagement. Besides being representative of women's inevitable and irreversible entry into the public spaces of our societies, we cannot be pushed back. Education also interfaces with the major divides around power and the control of resources in contemporary African social systems. Through access to knowledge, women have been able to engage with legal systems and initiate limited reforms in both public and private legal systems. While personal law, which is composed largely of conventions recodified into customary laws which remain deeply resilient to change, women have been able to link violation in the private domestic sphere to the larger societal systems of impunity and violence in the public arena. And Patricia made a reference to the 16 days. That's one of the expressions. Increasingly, however, studies on violence against women and their communities is being linked to militarism and the militarization of nations and regions on the continent. New work on rethinking human security and suggesting ways of mainstreaming gendered renditions of national and international security are taking the discourses on war and peace to more critical levels. This analysis has also been translated into political campaigns in countries like South Africa, Tanzania, Mozambique, Liberia, and Rwanda, for example. These campaigns link state expenditures on arms and military structures to glaring discrepancies in financial and budgetary accountability. The campaign for gender budgets by women's organizations, which uses the parliamentary platform to redefine the idea And the practice of financial and social accountability is one such outcome that is changing the meaning of citizenship by repositioning people in an active relationship with the state in their respective societies. And for me, you know, when I first heard about the gender budgeting, I thought, oh no, not another performance. You know, I mean, really, Parliament is this musty, old, you know, boring sight in our societies. Doesn't shift an inch. I mean, look at the robes that people wear in that place, you know. And I was just like, oh no, I have to just turn away because I'm going to lose my friends who have decided to position themselves on that front, and they're so excited they want to raise this issue. Pregs Govenda and Togomache and all my dear friends. And then I thought, let me see, maybe there's something underneath this thing, you know. And I realized that, yes, by repositioning economic accountability as a political issue and connecting the two, which, because they're often separated, right? Political parties here, banks and Ministry of Finance over here, right? By positioning it in this very old and patriarchally resistant space called the Parliament, women were shifting the space, okay? Shifting the energy, okay? And redefining accountability. Demanding that the state be accountable in new ways. This is one of the most important activities that we have to do in order to become citizens in our societies. If we don't know how to make the state accountable, we cannot change it. Because you see, often we think of accountability as though it's just about figures. But no, accountability is a powerful, powerful process of engagement that changes the state. Because what is the state? It's a conglomeration of relationships around power. That's all it is. The state is a historical phenomenon constituted of powers, relations of power that are situated in the control of the most critical and the most abundant resources in our societies. Material and structural, okay? The land, the infrastructure of the state, the police, the military, all that. That's the state. But it's relationships. And people often think, oh, the state is that powerful thing over there, you know, a deity. And so we are not able to position ourselves in a relationship with the state. And this is one of my criticisms also of this new moment, which is being increasingly dominated and hegemonized by humanitarianism. Humanitarianism is the biggest threat that we face as citizens in our continent. Because what it is doing, what the people who define and travel through humanitarianism, their organizations, their money, their technologies, their sympathy, okay, their media, is that they're positioning themselves between us and the state. We cannot engage our states because Human Rights Watch is fighting for our human rights. Amnesty International is now fighting for our, you know, where are we? So what is happening is that we're being pushed back into the social, political margins of our societies where we were under colonialism. When the colonial